Agnew brings it out of the end zone. Agnew still running. Agnew down the sideline. Agnew touchdown Jacksonville. 109 yards. Incredible.
Jackson has time. Now he's taking a deep shot. Brown is down there. And he's got it. Oh, what a catch. Marquise Brown.
Across the middle. Able to pick up the first and a whole lot more. Antonio Brown will not be touched. 62 yards.
Mayfield able to get away, and now he'll uncork it for the end zone. Ball in the air, and it's caught! It's caught! Donovan Peoples-Jones! Baker's prayer is answered from 57 yards out.
Deep ball, and somehow they blew the coverage. It's Bourne to the end zone. The Patriots strike magic.
Fields stumbling, trying to cut it back. Justin Fields making magic happen. There goes Fields. Touchdown!
They give it to him on 2nd and 10, and he breaks a big one. He might take it all the way. As Chubb takes it to the end zone for the touchdown. 70 yards.
Down by one. Pressure coming. Cousins decked. Throws it up for Jefferson. He's got it! And he is in! Touchdown, Minnesota!
Kittle is on the move. Oh, and he broke the tackle. Kiss him goodbye. 48-yard touchdown catch and run.
Herbert stops, launches deep. Jalen Guyton, he's got it! Touchdown Chargers! What a throw!
Wilson somehow escapes. He's going to run for it. Plenty of green grass. Wilson stays in bounds. He's still going, and he's in. Touchdown!
Welcome in, everyone, to the LuckyShots podcast. This is the final fantasy show of the year. What a year it was. A lot of highs, a lot of lows, but what a great year of fantasy football it was this year. Today on the show, it's the award show, so we're going to have the top performers, top performances. As you kind of heard at the beginning here, a lot of top plays happened this year. And then we'll get to the awards, a lot of fun awards that we're going to give out at the end of this show. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop in to some of the top players throughout the entire year. We'll start at the quarterback position, the guys rounding out the top 5. Number 2, you had Justin Herbert with 353.34 fantasy points overall this year, had 4,631 yards, 35 passing touchdowns, 14 interceptions, 301 yards on the ground, and 3 touchdowns. Keep in mind, these stats don't have Week 18. Because if you're playing fantasy football in Week 18, whoever your league commissioner is kind of an asshole. A lot of people don't play, things like that. So Week 17, the week before the final week of the season, should be the fantasy football season finale. So we're not counting any Week 18 stats. At the number 3 spot, you have Tom Brady. He had 349.7 fantasy points, almost nearly 5,000 yards at 49.90, 40 touchdowns, 12 interceptions, 81 rushing yards, and 2 touchdowns. Pat Mahomes sitting at the 4 spot. He had 335.46 fantasy points, 4,500 yards, 35 touchdowns, 13 interceptions, a little over 300 yards on the ground, and 2 rushing touchdowns. And to round out your top 5 for the year at the quarterback position was Aaron Rodgers. He had 319.08 fantasy points, very close to 4,000 with 3,977 passing yards, 35 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, 94 rushing yards, and 3 more touchdowns on the ground. Now over to the running back position, you had Austin Eckler at that 2 spot, right behind the guy who got first. He had 314.9 fantasy points, 847 on the ground with 11 rushing touchdowns, 65 rushing yards, 612 yards through the air, and 7 touchdowns receiving. At the number 3 spot, you had Najee Harris as a rookie getting up into that 3 spot. He had 291.2 fantasy points, 1,100 yards, 7 rushing touchdowns, 70 receptions for 440, and 3 touchdowns through the air. What a year for Najee Harris, especially being that he's a rookie. At the number 4 spot, a guy I'm going to have to eat my words on. I was not high on him to begin the season. He proved me wrong. He got up into the top 5 for the entire year. That's Joe Mixon. He had 287.9 fantasy points throughout the season, 1,200 yards rushing, 13 touchdowns, 42 receptions for 314, and 3 touchdowns through the air. And then a guy we're going to get to a little later in the show, but Leonard Fournette hops up into this top 5. Impressive because he didn't play the last 2 or 3 weeks of the season. But he's rounds out that top 5 for your top running backs. 255.6. He had 812 rushing yards, 8 rushing touchdowns, 69 receptions for 454, and 2 touchdowns through the air. Now for your wide receivers, this was a position dominated by one guy. We'll talk about him later. But there were still a lot of great performers throughout the season. And these are the guys rounding out the top of that list. Devonte Adams sitting at the 2 spot. He had 332.8 fantasy points, 162 targets for 117 receptions, 1,498 yards, and 11 touchdowns. Deebo Samuel, as Mr. Vic Quick would say, he had 310 fantasy points with 115 targets, 73 receptions, 1,300 yards, and 6 touchdowns. He also added 320 rushing yards and 7 touchdowns on the ground. At the number 3 spot, Justin Jefferson had a huge rookie year, had an even bigger year this year, 308.3 fantasy points, 160 targets, 103 receptions, 1,500 yards, 9 touchdowns, and 10 rushing yards. And then, since I've been playing fantasy football, I have not seen a rookie inside the top 5 of any position. This year we've got 2. Jamar Chase up in the top 5 for wide receivers. Finished out the year with 300 fantasy points, 124 targets, 79 receptions, 1,400 yards, 13 touchdowns, and 21 rushing yards. Now to finish off the list of top guys for the end of the year, top tight ends. We got Travis Kelce sitting at the 2 spot. So who the heck is the number 1 tight end if it's not Travis Kelce or even George Kittle, as you can see right under him. Travis Kelce had 249.4 with 129 targets, 88 receptions, just over 1,000 yards receiving, 8 receiving touchdowns, and a rushing touchdown. Right under him is George Kittle with 192. He had 87 targets, 66 receptions, 900 yards through the air, 9 receiving touchdowns, and 20 rushing yards. What makes his stuff impressive is he was out for quite a few games, came back, and absolutely dominated when he got back. So a great year from him. A guy that probably no one expected to see, and if you thought it was going to be a Dallas tight end, you would have thought maybe Blake Jarwin, but Dalton Schultz, an absolute stud, an absolute tight end that came out of nowhere this year, had 191.7 points on 101 targets, 75 receptions for 787 and 6 touchdowns. And then let's just keep up with the routine of having these rookies up in the top 5, with Kyle Pitts finishing inside the top 5 for tight ends. He had 173.8 points, 105 targets, 66 receptions for just over 1,000 yards. The only kicker is he only had 1 touchdown the entire season. Imagine if this kid gets more touchdowns next season, the absolute force he will be for fantasy football. I mean, got up inside the top 5 with 1 touchdown. Give him 5 touchdowns. Give him 8, give him even 6 that Dalton Schultz has. It's gonna be absolutely insane to see what he does once he starts getting touchdown receptions. Now, those are all of the guys that round out the top 5. But what were some of the top performances this season? Well, don't have to go very far to look at some of these. Right out of the gates, we had big games all the way up until the end of the season. So let's start it out with Week 2, Derrick Henry.
Here's Derrick Henry with some nice running. Henry trying to turn it on inside the 30, stays on his feet, and he will go! Derrick Henry, 60 yards!
As you can hear, absolutely great play there. Great game for him. He ended with 47.7 fantasy points in that game, 182 rushing yards, 3 rushing touchdowns, 6 receptions, and 55 receiving yards. Now, let's move on to the same week, just a little later in the day, the next guy, Aaron Jones.
Rodgers with Jones floating out of the backfield and dancing into the end zone.
Jones had 41.5 fantasy points in that game. Really was trying to chase down Derrick Henry that week. 67 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 6 receptions for 48 yards, and 3 receiving touchdowns. He did his absolute best to catch Derrick Henry. Just couldn't, just fell short. But what a week for both of those guys. Now we move on to Week 4. Singular guy had a huge week this week, and that guy was Tyreek Hill.
The last 2 weeks has been a wake-up call for this team. You have to earn everything that you get in this league. That has to be their mindset every week. Mahomes, the time. Tyreek Hill circles. Does he have the angle? Diving for the pylon. And Hill gets in. Touchdown, Kansas City.
Hill ended with 47.6 fantasy points in that game, had 11 receptions, 186 receiving yards, and 3 touchdowns. I was a guy that got to benefit from that early in the season, and, he's just a guy that can go out and do that. If you look at his whole body of work, it was a little shaky, but still had a pretty good year. But that week, he definitely won you your fantasy matchup. Now as we go to Week 5, we've got 3 performers, 3 guys who went out and absolutely killed it. The first one is Justin Herbert.
Coming into today, the Chargers led the NFL in drops with 11 drops, and that was really more of just a good defense.
He's got Williams deep on 3rd and 10. You can kiss him goodbye. Touchdown, 72 yards. Wow.
Herbie fully loaded had 42.82 fantasy points for 398 passing yards, 4 touchdowns through the air, and he also tacked on 29 rushing yards for a touchdown as well. I had him all year. I loved it, and that game was huge. But not to be outdone by the next guy, Lamar Jackson, who, little backstory, I had Justin Herbert go off for that many points, had a great lead. All I needed was Lamar Jackson to not have a big game. Well, guess what? Lamar Jackson had a big game.
From the 43 of Indianapolis, Lamar loads up for Marquise Brown. Makes it look easy for 43. Grease, they go right over Bo Peep Keys for the touchdown. First touchdown of the night for the Ravens.
He ended with 41.88 fantasy points, one of the absolute best passing performances I've ever seen from Lamar Jackson. 442 passing yards for 4 touchdowns and 62 yards on the ground. But guess what? Same game. Guess who? His favorite target, Mark Andrews.
Jackson with all sorts of time. Now throw. Caught. Andrews. Touchdown. Ravens.
Andrews finished with 41.7. He had 11 catches for 147 and 2 touchdowns. That was also just a great game. Baltimore had to absolutely just go off on offense because of how the game was going, and both of those guys benefited. Whoever had both of those guys definitely won their weeks because those were game-winning performances. Now we're going to jump down the line to another singular week for a big game, Week 9. This guy was one of the greatest, just surprises of the year. And he had quite a few big weeks, but this week was especially huge, James Conner.
He is impressive.
Pressure coming. McCoy rush. Floats it out to Conner. Blockers in front. First down and more. Conner turning on the speed. Looking over his shoulder. Nobody's going to catch him. It's a touchdown. 45 yards for James Conner. Third time today that he's found the end zone, and the Cardinals stretch the lead.
Conner had 40.3 fantasy points in that game, 96 yards on the ground, 2 rushing touchdowns, and tacked on 5 receptions for 77 yards and a receiving touchdown. Again, James Conner was one of the big surprises of the year and was a total touchdown machine. And if somebody was smart enough to take him in the draft, they benefited. And if somebody was lucky enough to get him after the draft, he definitely helped out your campaign this year. Moving on to Week 11, it was another running back shootout. This time, it was between Jonathan Taylor and Austin Eckler. The first one, Austin Eckler, because he came in second.
Can he get in for the fourth time? He does! Austin Eckler for the touchdown.
Eckler finished with 41.5 fantasy points, had 50 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, 6 receptions for 65 yards, and 2 touchdowns through the air. That game was the end of the day. The bigger game was from Jonathan Taylor earlier in the day, and Austin Eckler was chasing that game from Jonathan Taylor.
Hines. Nelson a block. And they go for Taylor at the great move by Johnson. Dances to the 5. Rips his way in. Touchdown. Another one.
Taylor had 53.4 fantasy points, 185 yards on the ground itself, 4 rushing touchdowns, and then tacked on 3 receptions for 19 yards and another touchdown. Absolutely big week. 53 fantasy points. Just absolutely insane. And, eventually he would be outdone by somebody else, but 53 points was untouchable, it seemed, for most of the season. Now we move on to the next week. Leonard Fournette in Week 12 had an absolute monster game.
Aaron Leftwich. This has got to have it play.
Jumbo formation. They were running at a big hole. Who needs a field goal? Fournette goes for the end zone, and he's in! Touchdown, Tampa Bay! His 4th of the day!
Fournette finished with 44.1 fantasy points, had 100 yards rushing, 3 rushing touchdowns, and added on 7 receptions for 31 yards and another touchdown. And he is another guy we will talk about in a little bit. But let's move on to Week 15. We now got Week 15, 16, and 17 all had gigantic games from someone. Week 15, it was Travis Kelce's turn.
Now just one catch shy of Otis Taylor. Here is Kelce. Still going. Still going. Kelce. Good night. Touchdown. Chiefs win it.
Kelce had 41.1 fantasy points on 10 receptions for 191 yards and 2 touchdowns through the air. One of the best tight end performances of the year. Was chasing down Mark Andrews' 41.7. Just came up a little short, but absolute great game. Finished in second to Mark Andrews for the top performance of the year. But hey, 41 points, you're not going to complain about it when he's on your team. Week 16, you had T. Higgins. This passing offense this year for the Bengals went absolutely crazy. T. Higgins wasn't necessarily the top guy, but he had a huge week in Week 16.
Baltimore took that timeout. They've got 2 left since he out of timeouts. Blocked by Williams, going deep, double teamed. Higgins has got the ball at the 5. That was spectacular. 52-yard reception to the 3.
Higgins had 43.4 fantasy points with 12 receptions for 194 yards and 2 touchdowns. 194 yards, just absolute monster catches throughout that game. And then tack on 2 touchdowns, absolutely incredible. But that was not to be outdone by the next week when the overall top fantasy performance of the year came out from his teammate and number 5 in the wide receivers, Jamar Chase.
Got an open target. It's Chase at the 40. Look at that move. Look at Chase go! Oh my goodness, what a gear he just found! Chase for the touchdown! Wow, Chase is on the case!
Chase ended with 55.6 fantasy points. He had 11 receptions for 266 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns. Just all gigantic touchdowns. It was kind of the MO of Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase all year to hook up on the deep one, and they did it so many times in Week 17, and Jamar Chase and his fantasy owners were the beneficiaries of that. All right, so all the build-up now to these awards. Let's hop right in. The first award, we're going to just start out with the top quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. So, without further ado, the top quarterback of the season was this man, Josh Allen.
Here's Allen, end zone, 4 touchdown passes today. Emmanuel Sanders grabs that one.
Allen stepping up, flushed out, directs traffic, fires it wide open, is knocked. Allen flushed out of the pocket, 53 yards for a touchdown.
Allen under some pressure. He'll run out of there and throw end zone, and all by himself is Cole Beasley for the Buffalo touchdown.
Allen on the move, trying to keep it himself. Allen cuts up and in. Touchdown.
Allen looking at Diggs, going at Diggs. Diggs got it. Buffalo touchdown. Stephon Diggs. Allen keeps it again. There's room there. Allen to the end zone. And Buffalo has his first touchdown.
Trying to get on the board. Allen has the time. Uncorks. Touchdown. He hits McKenzie for the score.
Allen ended the season with 378.72 fantasy points, averaging 23.7 points per game. Started out the season as the quarterback 2, ended as the quarterback 1. Had a total of 4,100 passing yards, 34 touchdowns through the air, 12 interceptions, but what really gave him that big boost was 700 rushing yards for 6 touchdowns. Allen had 4 30-point performances, 6 300-yard games, 7 3-touchdown games, 8 top 5 quarterback weeks, and top 5 quarterback weeks, and then 5 quarterback 1 weeks. Josh Allen absolutely dominated this season. There were some games where you were like, man, I wish I didn't have Josh Allen. But for a majority of the year, he was winning you fantasy weeks. 5 weeks at the top of the position with guys like Patrick Mahomes, Justin Herbert, all the guys we heard in the top 5. That's just absolutely incredible. And you can really attribute it to the amount of rushing that he had to do this season. And, he's a playoff-bound quarterback now, so he's just going to add on to an already great season. But the top quarterback of the year was Josh Allen. Now let's move on to the top running back of the year. Who was that? Well, we already kind of talked about him, and you're living under a rock if you don't know that it was one of the greatest running back performances of all time in fantasy football, in my opinion, Jonathan Taylor.
Try to get it out to Taylor on the screen, get some of the yardage back, and get the first down, and rip it down the sideline, now to the middle of the field. Jonathan Taylor, 76-yard touchdown.
Taylor breaking free, has a lead blocker. Taylor all the way down to the 5-yard line.
Wow, Taylor's gone. Jonathan Taylor. Goodbye. Touchdown, Indy.
They go for Taylor at the great move by Johnson. Dances to the 5. Rips his way in. Touchdown. Another one.
Taylor's going to finish it. Jonathan Taylor to the house. Good night.
Taylor finished with 360.6 fantasy points. He had 22.5 per game. Started out the season as the running back 10. He had 1,700 yards rushing, 18 touchdowns, and 37 receptions for 342 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns through the air. What did Jonathan Taylor do all season? Well, a lot. He had 6 20-point games, 2 30-point games, and a 50-point game. He had 10 games where he notched at least 100 rushing yards and 12 games where he had a touchdown. 5 of those were multi-touchdown games, and he had 7 weeks inside of the top 5. And believe it or not, he only had 1 week as running back 1. But hey, when you're in the top 5 for nearly half the season and you rack up 10 games with 100 yards, 12 games with a touchdown, 5 of those being multiple touchdowns, absolutely huge season for Jonathan Taylor. At the top wide receiver position, the absolute best performer of the entire season, just every week you were not failed to, or he never failed to impress, and that man was Cooper Kupp.
Stafford, end zone, touchdown. It's Kupp, his second of the game. Wide open, Kupp, touchdown, Rams.
Fake to Wood. Stafford throws. It is caught. It is a touchdown. Cooper Kupp tight roping the sideline. And a quick toss to Kupp, and Cooper Kupp backs his way in for the touchdown and the Rams lead.
Stafford rolling to his right and throwing that way and snuck it in for Cooper Kupp. Touchdown for the Rams.
End zone throw. They can't take him away. Touchdown Rams, Cooper Kupp. And he sets the Ram record.
Kupp finished with 412 fantasy points, 25 per game. Absolutely insane. Started the year out as wide receiver 18, had 138 receptions, 1,800 yards, and 15 touchdowns. Cooper Kupp, his stat line, pretty dang impressive. He had 6 30-point games, 7 20-point games, 10 100-yard receiving games, 5 double-digit catch games, 10 games with at least a touchdown, 5 of those having multiple touchdowns, 7 weeks inside the top 5 for wide receivers, and 3 wide receiver 1 weeks. Just an absolute impressive, beautiful, just everything. He had such a great year. Very envious that I did not find him on my teams, but whoever did have him, I know from experience that one guy in my league literally was carried most of the year by Cooper Kupp. Fantastic performance from him. Now we'll move on to the top tight end of the year. Who was it? Well, we just saw Travis Kelce, George Kittle not be up there. So first thought, maybe Darren Waller. Well, no, he was hurt for most of the year. The top tight end was Mark Andrews.
Andrews, unbelievable one-handed grab. Now finally throws. No way they can cover that long. It's Mark Andrews. Jackson with all sorts of time. Now throws. Caught. Andrews. Touchdown. Ravens.
Here's a throw. Andrews again holding on for dear life as ill. They can't bring him down. Look at him. Wow, he's a beast. Huntley zeroes in the end zone. Caught for the touchdown. Andrews. Threading the needle. 9-yard throw.
End zone and caught. Andrews. What a start. Touchdown Ravens.
Oh, there goes the ball, and he's got Andrews. Touchdown. What a play by the quarterback.
Andrews finished with 284.6 fantasy points, 17 points per game. Started out the season as the tight end 5, but worked his way all the way up. Not a bad year for him. 99 receptions, for 1,200 yards and 9 touchdowns. Andrews had 5 weeks with at least 15 points, 2 weeks with 20 points, and 1 week with 30 points, along with 1 week with 40 points. He had 4 100-yard games, 3 games with double-digit catches, 7 games with a touchdown, 2 games with 2 touchdowns, and 9 top 5 performance weeks, with 2 of those being a top tight end performance. And from weeks 10 through 17, he only missed the top 5 once. So for that gigantic stretch of games, he didn't miss. And especially that far into the season. And at that point in fantasy seasons, that's huge. If you can count on him to have those kind of performances, especially when you get into your fantasy playoffs, what a year for Mark Andrews. Now we're going to move on to the Rookie of the Year. You have plenty of candidates. Najee Harris, Jalen Waddle, Mac Jones, I guess. Not really for fantasy, but there's one guy without question that is just easily the Rookie of the Year, and that is Jamar Chase.
Going deep, Jamar Chase. He's got it. Chase to the end zone. That's a Bengal touchdown.
Caught by Chase. Oh my goodness, what a grab. 34-yard touchdown throw.
Fires downfield to Jamar Chase. He's got it. Wow. And takes it all the way for a Bengals touchdown. 70 yards from Burrow to Chase. Wow.
Chase found it. Oh, there he goes. But he's off to the races. This will be 6. What a play. 82 yards.
Corner. Caught. Jamar Chase. Touchdown. Look at Chase go. Oh my goodness, what a gear he just found. Chase for the touchdown. Wow, Chase is on the case.
Chase ended the year with those 300 points, 18 points per game, number 1 rookie in fantasy this season. Finished as the wide receiver 5, had 79 catches, 1,400 yards, 13 touchdowns, 21 rushing yards. But let's look a little more in depth at what Chase did this year. He had 4 20-point games, 1 30-point game, and a 50-point game. He had 3 100-yard games, 2 200-yard games, 9 games with a touchdown, 3 games with multiple touchdowns, 3 weeks inside of the top 5, and he had 1 top wide receiver week, obviously week 17 that we heard earlier, but absolutely just, he's another one I'm going to have to apologize to. I was not very sold on Jamar Chase, and guess what? He went out there week in and week out, made big plays every single week, it seemed like. And, 13 touchdowns, it seemed like he had at least 1 every single week. That was a deep 30, 40, 50-yard pass from Joe Burrow. That connection really took off, and Chase had an absolutely incredible year. Now we're going to move on to the Breakout Player of the Year. There are so many candidates for this. We just talked about, one earlier. James Conner was a very good candidate. Mr. Touchdown Machine himself. But if you look at where these people started, where they were last year, and where they are now, the guy I decided to go with for the Breakout Player of the Year was Leonard Fournette.
Hands it off, and in for the touchdown is Fournette.
That was easy. Touchdown Fournette.
Fournette gets through and gets in. His 3rd of the day. Touchdown, Tampa. Big hole. Who needs a field goal? Fournette going for the end zone, and he's in. Touchdown, Tampa Bay. His 4th of the day.
Brady rolling right to Fournette in the end zone. Touchdown.
It's Fournette. Look at Fournette go. Hides. The only guy that can stop him, but does not. Shoves him into the end zone. Touchdown, Tampa Bay.
Fournette finished with 255.6 fantasy points, had 18.3 per game, started out as the running back 32, so pretty far down there, and ended with 812 rushing yards, 8 touchdowns, 69 receptions for 454, and 2 touchdowns through the air. He had 3 20-point games, a 30-point game, a 40-point game, 6 games with touchdowns, 2 games where he had multiple touchdowns, 2 games with 100 yards, 7 games with at least 5 receptions, which as a running back, those receptions are huge. And he only played 14 games. That's pretty impressive. And what makes it more impressive is 3 of those weeks he was inside the top 5. 1 of those weeks he was the top running back. You know, you can only imagine where his stat line may have been if he got to play the last 3 games, and maybe how far he moved up, inside of that top 5. But absolutely great year from Leonard Fournette. Very impressive and kind of out of nowhere. I at least expected Ronald Jones to kind of be the guy, but it was not him. It was Leonard Fournette. Now on to the comeback player of the year. Plenty of guys, available for this as well. Guys like Dak Prescott, who was out in the entirety of last season. Well, we're not going with Dak Prescott. Sorry, Vic. We're going with a guy you also like, Vic, so don't get too angry. Deebo Samuel.
Deebo Samuel with the catch. He'll take it all the way for the touchdown. 79 yards. Deebo Samuel, how did he get that open? It's a foot race, and it's a 76-yard house call. My goodness. Here is Samuel.
Oh! Samuel takes that handoff out of the backfield and into the end zone. Touchdown, 49ers. And it's Samuel breaking away. Touchdown, 49ers.
This is Samuel on 1st and 10 from the 20. He's inside the 10, the 5 still going to the end zone. Touchdown. It's Samuel, and Deebo Samuel takes it in for a Niners touchdown.
Deebo ended with 310 fantasy points, 20 points per game. In 2020, he was injured, had things going on, wasn't all that great. Was the wide receiver 93. Clear down there. Barely in the top 100 for wide receivers. And this year ended as the wide receiver 3. 73 receptions, 1,300 yards, and 6 touchdowns. And proved to be an absolute force on the ground as well, as he had 320 rushing yards and 7 touchdowns on the ground. He had 4 20-point performances, 3 30-point performances, 5 games with 100 receiving yards, 10 games with a touchdown, 3 games with multiple touchdowns, and was inside the top 5 4 times, finished as the top wide receiver once. So just absolutely great. I had him in 2 separate leagues, benefited both of those leagues, and just absolute playmaker. Really excited to see if he can help San Francisco make a huge run in the playoffs. But talk about a guy that really had a just huge down year all the way to the top, just skyrocketing from where he was last year. Absolutely great year for Deebo Samuel. Now we're going to move on to the sleeper of the year. Quite a few guys that obviously could take this, but a guy that really came on at the end of the season, was very quiet about his success, which makes him the perfect candidate for the sleeper. Guy that you probably didn't pay any attention to until he was putting up, 15, 16, 20 points on you. You didn't really, pay attention to who or how he was doing this season, and that guy is Hunter Renfrow.
Fastball, caught, Renfrow, touchdown Raiders. Carr had some green in front of him and zips it in for the touchdown. Hunter Renfrow.
Caught, great time, and a touchdown. Renfrow. He beats Bradbury in a 2-yard touchdown pass.
Low slam, caught in the end zone. Hunter Renfrow with a touchdown.
Carr, caught, Renfrow, touchdown, Raiders. Carr on 4th and 2, rolling right, throws to the end zone. Touchdown, Renfrow.
Renfrow finished the season with 242 fantasy points, 15 points per game. Very, very good average for that. Started out as the wide receiver 84, ended just outside the top 10 at the wide receiver 11. He had 99 receptions, or 1,025 receiving yards, and 7 touchdowns. Since week 8, which was their bye week, he had 152.3 fantasy points, averaging 17 points per game for the second half of the season. Absolutely great. Just a lot of targets, a lot of catches, went out, got touchdowns, and, there was a few weeks I picked him up towards, the middle of that run. There was a few weeks he bailed me out. Absolutely wouldn't even think of him because, one, the Raiders weren't really on the radar until the very end of the year. And two, Hunter Renfrow wasn't going out and putting up, Jamar Chase numbers or anything like that, but was getting a lot of targets, getting a lot of catches, and was very viable for fantasy in that flex position or even as a wide receiver too. So, great year for Hunter Renfrow. Now we're going to move on to the waiver wire hero. So who's somebody that was more than likely not drafted, sitting on the waiver wire, and then all of a sudden breaks out and has a huge year starting from the waiver wire. That guy is none other than a guy I talk about all the time on this show, Cordarrelle Patterson.
Good cut. Cordero Patterson breaks a tackle, and he's in for the touchdown. Patterson has it in the first down. Still on his feet. Cordero Patterson breaks another tackle on his way. Touchdown, Atlanta.
Matt Ryan finding Cordero Patterson, and Patterson's got a touchdown. Ryan to Patterson, 42 yards. Cordero Patterson with a catch, a little stop, breaks a tackle to the goal line. Patterson in for the touchdown. Patterson in the end zone, he's got it again. Third touchdown catch for Cordero Patterson. Cordero Patterson with a catch inside the 5, diving across for the touchdown. Patterson again, trying to chug to the outside, diving for the pylon. Touchdown, Atlanta. Cordero Patterson right up the gut, and Cordero Patterson into the end zone for his second touchdown of the first half.
Patterson ended with 232.4 fantasy points, averaging just over 15 points per game. Started the year out as the running back 89 and ended the year as the running back 7. He had 607 rushing yards, 6 touchdowns, 51 receptions for 547 yards and 5 touchdowns through the air. He had 4 15-point games, 2 20-point games, 1 30-point game, 300-yard rushing games, 7 games with a touchdown. 3 of those were multiple touchdowns, 6 games with 5 catches or more, and 2 times inside the top 5, with one of those being a top running back performance. Just absolutely incredible. And just imagine, where he would have been at the end of the season had the Falcons continued with the same game plan they had for him throughout the first half of the season. They started getting away from throwing him the football, wasn't putting up as great of numbers as the beginning of the year, but still absolutely great and very viable. And if you were like me, started out with not very many running backs, he was a godsend that you could put into your running back position, and almost it's a wide receiver almost at your running back position. Coming off the waiver wire, I mean, you could argue that maybe James Conner, but most people drafted James Conner very late in the rounds, but Cordarrelle Patterson was a guy that definitely slipped off the board because everybody was sold on Mike Davis. I was sold on Mike Davis. So what a year for Cordarrelle Patterson, and see if he can do it next year. Now we move on to the second to last award. We do have an honorable mention at the end, but the fantasy playoff hero. So who was a guy that was not on the radar at all, and then fantasy playoffs came and he absolutely won you championships if you had him. I had him. I didn't win because I had him on my bench, but that's besides the fact. We'll just get past that. So the fantasy playoff hero of the year was Amon-Ra St. Brown.
Amon-Ra St. Brown with a game winner with zeros on the clock.
Throws it! Caught! Touchdown, Amon-Ra St. Brown! 37 yards!
High, but caught! Amon-Ra St. Brown to the goal line! End zone! That's a touchdown, Lions!
Amon-Ra St. Brown, nice move. Amon-Ra, touchdown Lions. Guns it and touchdown. Amon-Ra St. Brown.
Throughout the fantasy playoffs, Amon-Ra St. Brown scored 84.9 fantasy points, averaging 28.3 points per game, and averaged the wide receiver 4 position throughout that time. He had 292 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, 47 yards on the ground, and a touchdown. And who's to say, you didn't play week 18? If you had a week 18 matchup, guess what? He had a great game then too. Somewhere in the neighborhood of like 25, 26 points. So what an absolute breakout at the very end of the season to save people's fantasy hopes. It'll be interesting to see if he continues this into next season and if he ends up being, one of those top wide receivers that we're talking about constantly week to week. But for this year, he waited until the absolute perfect time to go off for whoever had him and hopefully carry them pretty far down the playoff ladder. Now moving on to the final real award, the Fantasy King. We talked all year about the Fantasy Kings of the week. This one is for the entire year, and really there's no surprise at who it is. It's Cooper Kupp. We're not going to do an intro for him because we did one just a few minutes ago, but Cooper Kupp had 3 top 3 finishes, 7 top 5s, 13 times inside the top 10. He had 7 20-point games, 6 30-point games, 10 100-yard games, 5 games with double-digit catches, 5 games with multiple touchdowns, and a touchdown in 10 games. I mean, all of those numbers equate massive fantasy production, and 412 fantasy points from a wide receiver, just absolutely unheard of. An insane amount of production from him this year. We'll see if that continues into next year, but I mean, it's a season that's going to be hard to match years to come for any other wide receiver. There's plenty of guys that can do it, but they're going to actually have to do it, and have to do it with Cooper Kupp still being an actual player, possibly trying to break his own feats from this year. Now, let's get the very last award, an honorable mention, because there was a guy who could have overtaken a few of these awards had he not gotten hurt halfway through the season, not even halfway through the season, about a third of the way through the season, and that is Derrick Henry.
Henry reverses field. Henry at the 5. Can he get in? He will! What a run! And a touchdown for Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry with some nice running. Henry trying to turn it on. Inside the 30. Stays on his feet. And he will go! Derrick Henry! 60 yards! Henry, and he's in for the touchdown. His 3rd score of the game. Henry to the end zone for the touchdown. He'll take it again, runs right through the middle, into the end zone like a torpedo. Henry first inside the 5, dives toward the goal line. Touchdown, Tennessee. He has scored again. 3 touchdowns for Derrick Henry in his homecoming.
Trying to get the big guy going, and he's going. And when I say going, he might go all the way. Nobody's going to catch him. Derrick Henry, touchdown. 76 yards.
So as I said, Henry didn't play an entire season. He only played 8 games. But in that 8-game span, he had 193 fantasy points, was averaging 24 per game, had 937 rushing yards, 10 rushing touchdowns, 18 catches for 154 receiving yards. In that 8 weeks, he was inside the top 5 4 times. The running back won twice. Had a 20-point game, 2 30-point games, and a 40-point game, and ended the season, rushing yards-wise, only playing 8 games, inside the top 10 at number 7. Absolute great year for Derrick Henry, and he only played 8 games. Hopefully, we're going to see him back in the playoffs, so that'll be, a very good joy to watch. Hopefully he can help Tennessee move throughout the playoffs, win, and get into the Super Bowl, because that's what I want to see. That's what I've predicted. But imagine the race that we would have had if he had never gotten hurt and Jonathan Taylor had the year he had. These two running head-to-head the entire season would have been bonkers to watch, would have been a lot of fun. But maybe we'll just have to wait until next year to see that happen. Hopefully they both stay healthy. But Derrick Henry, couldn't go throughout the show without giving him a shout-out, because he very well could have been the top running back, fantasy king. He could have been taken over quite a few awards. But, ladies and gentlemen, that is it for the award show. I hope you enjoyed. I enjoyed making it. I enjoyed looking at just the amount of crazy games that happened this year, the amount of crazy performances, and seeing who had these kind of seasons. Looking into next year, who are going to be some of the guys you want to look at, But that is it for the fantasy show. That is the final fantasy show of the year. We will continue the game day show weekly until, the Super Bowl, until the season ends. And then it'll be on to next year. So it was fun talking about fantasy all year with you guys. It was fun, analyzing all of the games, all of the players. A fantastic fantasy season. I want to thank you all for tuning in every week. Really appreciate it. Don't forget to watch tomorrow. We'll have Dylan Corbett on the show. But that's it for fantasy. Thanks for watching.